You should be good now.
Hi, everybody. Sorry, we had a little bit of a technical glitch, which we now have fixed. So thanks for your patience and waiting to join us, because we're super excited to be here and glad that you could join us, because keto diets and diabetes is certainly in the press, and a lot of people are talking about it. And through my own personal experience with my son, Mackenzie, who's had type 1 diabetes for a long time, he went on a keto diet some time ago, and I noticed some really positive changes. And I started to ask him a lot of questions. And then I realized a lot of people wanted to know more about keto, and particularly if you have diabetes. So we thought, who better to lead this discussion and answer questions than our good friend Jane Stevenson, who is a dietitian and a type 1 haver herself, as she describes herself. So we're really pleased that she's able to join us, and that you are as well. So I'm going to introduce Jane, and we can get underway to answer your questions, because I know that we've had a lot of questions submitted ahead of time. So Jane, thank you so much for joining us, and welcome everybody.
So hi everyone, I'll just introduce myself a little bit. So my name is Jane Stevenson. I currently live in Halifax, Nova Scotia. I am a newly registered dietitian as of June 2018. So I wrote my exam in May and then got my license in June. I graduated from St. FX University, which is in a small town in Nova Scotia. And I've had diabetes for this August will be my 14th diaversary. So I was diagnosed in 2005 when I was 10. And then I started on a pump in 2006 and started the CGM in 2016. So outside of my personal diabetes experience, I'll highlight what I've done working with other people with diabetes. I have a lot of experience going to diabetes camps. So I went as a camper from the year I was diagnosed on, and then I was a counselor for 4 years. For the past 2 summers through my dietetic internship, I went to diabetes camps on the healthcare team. And then this past summer, I've already done 1 diabetes camp as a registered dietitian, and I'm going to another one in mid-August. And also through my dietetic internship in my clinical placement, I did a rotation at the diabetes clinic in my hometown. So through that was a lot more focused on type 2, but we did see some type 1s in there as well. So kind of a nice, well-rounded experience so far in diabetes, and I hope to be able to pursue my CBD as well. So I guess we'll kind of get into a little bit of an introduction before we sort of get heavy into the questions that people have sent in. So I've done a few presentations on this topic, and I kind of like to just start out with, saying what is a keto diet, because we hear this a lot of times in the media. A lot of people are purporting the benefits for weight loss. But you don't see a lot of it specific to diabetes. So to kind of go through what this keto actually means. So keto is basically any diet with a decrease in carbohydrates. And those definitions differ, which makes it difficult to do research on, both for yourself and as someone like me who does it, researches this for professional purposes. It's difficult when you're looking into the studies, because for some, they say under 50 carbs a day is considered low carb. And for others, they say under 15 carbs a day. So those of us who count carbs, I think, can really appreciate the difference there. There isn't really one standard definition of low carb, but a lot of the websites will tell you that the fewer carbs you eat, the quicker you will enter the state of ketosis, which we'll touch on a little bit later. Some of the diets will also recommend a restriction on protein, which is something I, as a dietitian, will never recommend, but some will recommend a protein restriction. In the typical North American diet, we do tend to eat lots and lots of protein, so that doesn't tend to be an issue. But some websites will recommend not eating a lot of protein in order to kind of push yourself into that state of ketosis a little quicker. another sort of rule of thumb of the keto diet is a very high focus on fats. So both saturated and unsaturated fats. So just to break it down into the numbers a little bit. So Health Canada has something called the acceptable macronutrient distribution ranges, which is a very, very big and long way of just saying, how much of each nutrient should you have in your diet. So they like to say about 20 to 35% should be protein, 10 to 35% should be fat, and 45 to 65% should be carbohydrates. So those are kind of the normal recommendations for the general population. In low carbohydrate or keto diets, those ranges are a lot different. So they actually recommend fewer than 5% of your calories come from carbohydrates. So compare that to the 45 to 65% in general recommendations. The keto diets recommend 65 to 75% of your diet being fat, whereas in the normal recommendations, they say 10 to 35%. And in the keto, they say 15 to 20% should be protein, whereas in the normal recommendations, they say 20 to 35%. So that one's a little bit more in line. So the protein is a little more in line with what we see for the general population. But the keto diets do recommend a lot more fat and a lot fewer carbohydrates. So I'll go into a little bit of what keto actually means. I know we hear the term a lot, and I'll try and keep this explanation short and sweet so it's not a physiology or a biochemistry lesson. But basically, as human beings, our bodies thrive on glucose, which is the fancy word for sugar, basically. So glucose or sugar is derived from the carbohydrates in the food that you eat. And that's stored in your muscles and liver in the form of what's called glycogen. So glycogen is the word for stored sugar, pretty much. And this is what keeps us going. So this is what allows our cells to continue to divide and allow us to be able to grow and move about the world. So what happens when you eat carbohydrates in your body, your glycogen stores fill up, and then anything excess is stored as fat. So in keto diets, they recommend eating very few carbohydrates. So this uses up your stores of glycogen. So that stored sugar gets used up, and then your body starts to dip into your fat stores. So it's almost mimicking the starvation response. So once your body is dipping into those fat stores, it produces what are called ketones. And these are kind of the body's second favorite form of energy. So they can be used for energy, but it's not the body's favorite thing to do. And your muscles can also get used up into energy for the brain. So if you're someone who is working out a lot and trying to build muscle, might not be the ideal diet for you. So when your body enters this state of ketosis, so this is probably around day 10 of dramatically limiting your carbohydrates, your metabolism slows down a lot, and basically it's telling your body to store any food that it takes in. So basically once you start eating those carbohydrates again, your body's going to want to store all that. So it does slow down your metabolism a lot. So that's something to sort of keep in mind. So the term keto diet comes from producing ketones or being in ketosis, which basically means using your fat stores for energy. So hopefully that was a quick and easy explanation. But I understand that we're not all physiology professionals, so it can be very complex and very hard to understand. So I'll check in with Melanie now. Do we have any questions that we want to start with, or anything that anyone sent in?
Yeah, well, thanks a lot for actually giving that explanation. Someone here is asking us about ketones and what's the difference between ketones with diabetes and ketones with a ketone diet. Are there any differences?
So on kind of a molecular level, the ketone bodies that are produced in what's called nutritional ketosis, they're the same as what would be produced in someone with diabetes. Now, a lot of us have heard of DKA, or a diabetic ketoacidosis, which is, so ketosis is basically kind of what I just summarized. So your brain and your body cells are using fat for energy and producing the ketone bodies. And then in this diabetic ketoacidosis, this basically happens when the blood sugars are too high and there's a shortage of insulin. So it builds up keto acids in the blood, which can alter the blood pH. And basically the result of that could be death, coma, things like nausea, vomiting. If anyone's ever been hospitalized with DK, it's not fun. And everyone's body is different, and some people's threshold for going into DK is very low. Like, I have friends who their blood sugars can be 14 and they have very high amounts of ketones. DKA, or diabetic ketoacidosis, is more common in those with type 1 because we don't make any insulin. So it's the lack of insulin that is kind of the trigger of that DKA. So in type 2 diabetes, which I won't go into a whole bunch, but because I know a lot of people that are tuning in are focused a lot on type 1. DKA is very, very rare in type 2 because they still produce insulin. It's just their body can't use it properly. So in someone that has type 1, for example, eating, normal amounts of carbohydrates, so, say they eat 30 to 50 grams of carbs for lunch and they dose their insulin for that, and, maybe they have a pump site failure, or maybe it's a hot day and the insulin is high, or for whatever reason, the insulin might not work. That person is going to end up with high blood sugars. So we define a high blood sugar as over 15.0 millimole per liter. And they may also have ketones. It's a lot easier to get ketones on a pump because you're only on short-acting insulin. So once that insulin stops working, you have a very small window before your blood sugars are going to shoot up and the ketones are going to come with them. On injections, you take a long-acting insulin. So that's going to be constantly working in the background. So even if maybe you forget your lunchtime dose, for example, you may still have high blood sugars, but you do still have a little bit of that background insulin that's working. So you may be less likely to go into DKA. But like I said, everyone's body is different, and your threshold for DKA may be less or more than someone else with type 1. And that's kind of the nature of all of that.
So another question here then is, going into ketosis safe for type 1s?
So this is the ultimate question, right? This is what everybody wants to know. And the issue is, this is something that's really not well researched. So low carbohydrate and keto diets in general are not super well researched. So we don't really know the long-term effects. We don't know the effects on, different body types. The keto diet was originally developed for people with epilepsy in the 1920s because it slows or stops seizures. And nowadays it's still used for people whose epilepsy is not responsive to drugs. So anytime you're looking into research into the keto diet, a lot of the studies are around people with epilepsy. And with nutrition research, it's really hard to get solid evidence because there's so many other things at play. There's other lifestyle factors, there's genetics. So from a research standpoint, we don't really know. From a sort of biochemical or biomedical standpoint, it's a lot easier to go into DKA if you are someone with type 1 diabetes and you're on a low carbohydrate diet. So if you have maybe minimal ketones, but your insulin delivery fails for some reason, which I think we can all appreciate that happens very, very often, especially, in the summertime or for people on pumps or whatever. If that insulin delivery is interrupted, you can go into DKA very easily because you already have those ketones on board. So they can very easily get up to dangerous levels.
So if somebody wanted to start, Sorry, I think there was a bit of a delay there. If somebody has diabetes type 1 and they want to start on a keto diet, what are the things that they should look for? How should they safely start to do it, and how should they monitor themselves?
So if I'm working in a diabetes clinic and I have a patient who comes to me and says that they want to start a keto diet, um, I always say, kudos to you. I never want to squash anyone's motivation, and if they are like, I really want to get my A1C under control, a dietitian and your whole diabetes team will work with you to develop strategies that are going to work for you to do that. So I can't comment on the whole population, but there are a lot of risks to it. And in people who, for example, someone with epilepsy that's not responsive to drugs, a physician may put them on a keto diet, and they're hospitalized for at least 4 days. They're monitored extremely, extremely closely. So I would caution anyone who wants to kind of quit carbs cold turkey and do keto at home. Um, Definitely talk to your diabetes team, and they will sort of point you in the right direction in terms of, maybe reducing carbs, or maybe you need a refresher on carb counting, because I think everyone's ultimate goal is to get that perfect A1C and that perfect blood sugar. And there are days when you're kind of like, I would do anything to get that. And it really feels like their traditional methods haven't been working. And I think that's the sentiment that I get from a lot of these sort of online forums that talk about low carb. But I really caution people against doing something that doesn't have a lot of research to back it. We have a lot of anecdotal evidence. So a lot of people are sharing their stories online, but that's not necessarily going to go into recommendations, because it's kind of doesn't eliminate all the variables that a research study might. If someone wants to reduce their carbs, to kind of eliminate that margin of error with the insulin dosing, I might be more willing to kind of help them with that. But I would be concerned, because you can run into things like electrolyte imbalances. So things like potassium, sodium, that your heart needs to keep going, and your muscles need to keep contracting. I would caution anyone against doing something that's going to, throw off things like your electrolyte balance.
So it's not just about the low carbohydrates. There's other things that you have to take into account then.
Yeah, there's a lot of different things at play, and a lot of different risks that you might not necessarily know unless you've kind of dived into it and researched it a lot. Because if you're looking it up on the internet, you're going to find tons and tons of stories of people having success with it. Because no one wants to put their worst foot forward online, right? We all want to look great online. So people are a lot more likely to share their success stories than to share a story where, something bad happened, or whatever that may be.
So one of our viewers, I guess, is already on a low carb diet and type 1, and want to know if the keto is safe. So for me, in my head, I'm thinking, well, if you're on low carb, what then pushes you to the keto diet or the ketosis? Is this something that you just monitor? Is it the same number of carbs that are restricted for each person, or does it vary? One person can go into ketosis on 20 carbs a day, whereas another person, it may take, I don't know, 15, or how does that work?
Yeah, so there's not really any solid kind of cutoff point of, this many carbs. I typically it's anything under, 30 to 50. But again, like, everyone's body is different, and there's not a ton of research into what that threshold is. The way that kind of the hardcore keto people will do it is they will get like an at-home ketone testing kit, and sort of try to cut all carbs out completely, and then monitor and kind of figure out where their own threshold is for being in ketosis. But in terms of, a level of carbohydrates to push you into ketosis, there's not really any set point. point of where that will be. So with people who are eating low carb, a lot of people kind of think of low carb and keto as the same thing when they may not necessarily. Like, a lower carb diet is one thing, and a diet where you're actually in ketosis may be something else.
If someone is going to be using the keto diet, do you recommend that they then have ketone, some kind of ketone testing equipment, whether it's strips or the meter?
Yeah, for sure. And again, that kind of puts up another barrier for people, because if you're someone who doesn't have insurance, the blood ketone meters give you the most up-to-date results, whereas the urine ketone meters aren't as specific, because they don't give you a specific number. It's just matching the color on the bottle. And the urine ketones are a little bit delayed, so that kind of tells you, maybe what your ketone level was whenever that urine was produced, whereas the blood ketones is kind of, right then and there. This is how many ketones or what your ketone level is at. But I would caution anyone against doing it without consulting with your diabetes. I think people kind of don't understand how dangerous it can be. And a lot of people are, seeing success stories online, and it's really appealing. So yeah, definitely, if there's anything to take away from this, it's consult with your own diabetes team. I definitely encourage you to find something that works for you. But yeah, I definitely say don't go it alone, and try to not consult Dr. Google too much.
So are diabetes teams generally open to discussing keto with their clients?
So I can only speak to the clinic that I have worked at, and sort of the professionals that I've talked to. So I'm in rural Nova Scotia, and we definitely don't tend to be kind of up on the latest trends. I think it varies, and through a lot of the online forums that I've read, some people say, yeah, my endocrinologist told me 100% go for it. And others are saying, no, my team is completely against it. The bottom line in Canada is that we, as regulated health professionals, have to follow, a code of ethics and standards of practice, and clinical practice guidelines that are updated, every 5 years or so. And are based in research. But the thing about research and the thing about clinical practice guidelines is they take a long time to come out. So, 5 years or 10 years down the road, it may come out that, okay, we've studied this, we've looked at the long-term impacts, this is the ideal level of carbohydrates for optimal blood sugar control. Or it may come out down the line, that this is unhealthy, or the long-term effects of this have been something that's not good for you. But the problem is, right now we don't know, and in the healthcare community especially, it's really hard to get research that doesn't have a lot of variables, and that's methodologically sound, which basically means we've kind of eliminated all the outside things that can affect what the outcome of that study will be.
I'm just looking at the people who have joined us, and for anybody who's just joined us recently, we're talking about keto and diabetes, and we're here with Jane Stevenson, a registered dietitian and a type 1 haver, and that's how she describes herself. I kind of like that. Maybe we can, the people that have joined us and they're interested in keto, and so I'm curious about why you're interested in keto. What have you heard? What appeals to you? Are you, I know we have one viewer who's already on a low carb diet, but why the interest, and how can we best, use the time with Jane to answer any specific questions that you have, so that you can maybe get, started on your way. And I'll just, anecdotally with my son, Mackenzie, he lost a ton of weight. His insulin requirements dropped dramatically, but I do know there was other stuff there where he was with the electrolytes and doing all of this taking these other supplements, if you will, to support his body. And I personally don't know enough about it. That's why I thought, oh, Jane would be a good one to ask. So if anybody has any questions, or even if they have experience themselves and would like to share that with us and have any specific questions, please, let us know.
Yeah, and something that I will kind of go into that I have heard a lot just on kind of the topic of weight loss. So I kind of have a list I kind of have a running list going of sort of the risks and benefits of this diet. It is great for the blood sugars. That is one thing that I will say. But kind of rolling off of that, I think we get very into focusing very, very heavily on the numbers. And as someone living with diabetes, you can place your entire self-worth on what the number on that meter says, or what the trend line is saying. It can be very discouraging if you're seeing a ton of time out of range, and it can really have an impact on your mental health. So having something that does improve your blood sugars and you can see those results right away, it seems like a miracle, and that's why we have these people who are so passionate about this. But it's kind of looking for those outside things and those other sort of risks and things to consider. So on the keto diet, it is also kind of a big fad in the weight loss world right now. People do find very, very rapid weight loss on the keto diet. And that can be very effective for a lot of people. So if weight loss is a goal for you, and so is blood sugar control, this may seem like the miracle. But basically, so I talked about glycogen a little bit earlier, which is the sugars or the glucose that your body stores in the muscles and the liver. Basically, when you are into ketosis, when your body has kind of gone into starvation mode and you've used up all your glycogen stores, glycogen holds water. So a lot of the rapid weight loss at the very beginning of starting a keto diet is your body getting rid of its glycogen stores and therefore flushing out all that water that the glycogen is holding on to. And that's also why we see things like this keto flu, because your body is having an electrolyte imbalance. So when it flushes out the water, electrolytes, the definition is basically just particles, charged particles dissolved in water. So that's things like sodium, potassium, magnesium. So when all that water gets flushed out, all the little particles that are dissolved in that water that our bodies need, our muscles and our hearts, those are all flushed out, and that can cause keto flu. So that's something I'll kind of touch on a little bit as well. So as most of us who are living with diabetes know, vomiting or sick days are something that they tend to very stress a lot in the clinics. So sick day guidelines and sick day management are something that whenever I was doing my placement in the clinic, we really focused on that. So make sure they know how to manage on sick days was kind of something that was drilled into my head as a student. So with keto flu, it's basically, you could have nausea, vomiting, weakness, mental fog, and it's basically your body trying to adjust to this dramatic shift in metabolism. So as someone with diabetes, when you start vomiting, I know for me at least, it's always kind of the alarm bells go off and I'm on high alert, because if your sugar's going low and you can't keep anything down, bad news, obviously. So that's something kind of another risk added onto it that us type 1 havers have to deal with, sort of on top of the risk of going into DKA. It's kind of the added risk of having something like nausea or vomiting, because if you have a low and you can't keep down a juice box, then that's a trip to the hospital and a glucose through an IV, basically.
So if somebody has type 1 diabetes and they don't want to, kind of go cold turkey or go, to such a low level of carbohydrate. Is there kind of a mid point that you would say, hey, if you're thinking about keto and lower carb diet, why don't you try focusing on, this number of carbs? And the other thing that we talked about too, which was important, is that people make sure that they're counting their carbohydrates properly as well. And maybe that's something that we can talk about in another Facebook Live, because there's different ways that you can do that. But I'm just wondering, because we've had a few people comment here, one was saying that their diabetic nurse was very much against keto diets because of patients ending up in the hospital. They're not sure how their nutrient feels. But maybe for those people that are looking for, a lower carb, there's, I don't know, like a safe range that they could try to use. What do you think?
I mean, so the macronutrient distribution ranges, which I kind of alluded to in the beginning, which are basically just the amount of sort of macronutrients, so carbohydrates, fats, and proteins are macronutrients. So the range of carbohydrates is 45 to 65% of your total calories. So carbohydrates have 4 calories per gram of carbohydrates. So a little bit of math involved there. But, start on the lower end. Go try, try the 45% of your calories. The only thing I'll caution with that, and, I am someone who is not a fan of diets and diet culture. I think there's, food is something to be enjoyed, and it's something that's so fundamental to the human experience. Counting calories and counting carbs is never fun. I know in patients without diabetes that I've counseled for weight loss, counting calories can lead to disordered patterns of eating. Unfortunately, us people with diabetes don't have that option to not be counting the food we're eating. So that, that's not an option for us, unfortunately. And there is research out there that says that the prevalence of eating disorders in females with type 1 diabetes, that's the research that the study was done on, and I imagine it would probably be the same for males. But the rates of eating disorders are a lot higher in those with diabetes. With type
we had another comment from one of our viewers, and I apologize. I think there's a little bit of a delay here, so I don't want to appear to be butting in on you.
No.
There was a question from Daniel about the keto diet. Is it something that you do indefinitely, or is it just short term? So we wanted to have your comments on that. Is it a lifestyle, or is it something that people just use to get themselves to a certain point? What's your experience with that?
So there's not really any specific recommendations around it in general thus far. I mean, if it's something that you're doing, anytime someone wants to change the way they're eating, as a dietitian, I always recommend that it be a lifestyle change and that it be done in a healthy way. Any diet where you're cutting out an entire food group always raises red flags for me, because affecting your relationship with food, and diets that cut out an entire group of foods usually tend to not be sustainable long term. So with any research that I've seen in the keto diet, there's almost no studies that actually study the diet long term. A lot of anecdotal evidence, people tend to say that they're a lot more sensitive to carbohydrates. So it's a very restrictive diet, and it's very hard to stay on. And so when people inevitably do start eating carbohydrates again, they find that they're very, very sensitive to the carbohydrates. So they tend to cause very high blood sugar spikes, and people who have lost weight tend to gain it all back. So this makes sense in terms of kind of the way our body works, whether you have diabetes or not. If you put your body into starvation mode and essentially slow down your metabolism, that's, you're kind of telling your body, we may not know where our next meal is coming from. So your body's going to say, oh, shoot, okay, anything you put in me, I'm just going to hold on to and store because I'm not sure if I'm going to get fed again, basically. So if you are someone who's doing a low carb or doing a keto diet, it is suggested that it's something you remain on, because once you come off of it, it's kind of throwing your body through that process again, and we're not really sure of the long-term effects, but basically told your body, okay, we're in an environment now where we may be starving, and then your body responds accordingly, because our bodies are really, really good at surviving and adapting to their environment. So that's kind of what your body does.
So there's two other comments here, and someone made a good point in that eating healthy is expensive, and I definitely agree there. And so I got to thinking about, well, if we're talking about reducing the number of carbohydrates, then the type of carbohydrates that we're going to be eating, is it important what carbs we choose for those limited number of carbs that we're going to have during the day? And then the second part to that question is, you talked about 45% of the calories to be carbohydrate when you're following keto. Would that be something that the person would follow each meal as they count carbs? Or what's the easiest way or the best way to do that?
Yeah, so I'll touch on that second point first, just go through kind of the mathy part of it. So the 45% of your day, so that's your daily calories. So there are 4 calories in 1 gram of carbohydrates. So I did a little example here. So if you're eating 1,500 calories per day, that's approximately 170 grams of carbs per day. So you kind of split that in your meals however much you want. So that's the normal recommendations. With the keto diet, or the very low carbohydrate diets, they recommend less than 5% of your diet be through carbohydrates. Now I didn't do the math for the 1,500 calories a day, and I'm not that good at math to do it in my head now, but that works out. I know a lot of them, recommend less than 30 or less than 15 grams of carbs per day. And then I guess, so I'll touch on kind of the quality of carbohydrates. And that's sort of what another kind of takeaway from this is, focusing on the quality of your food rather than quantity, and trying to kind of measure what you're eating, very strictly. I know it is difficult when you're having to count carbs, but rather than going keto right off the bat, try some lower glycemic index carbohydrates. So the glycemic index is basically kind of your simple carbs versus your complex carbs. And the complex carbs tend to stay in our system a little bit longer, and they're a little bit more predictable with your insulin dosing. So you're looking for whole grains, so making whole grain choices more often, including sources of protein at each meal and things like that, to kind of make the line like this rather than a spike and a drop. And then to kind of touch on the point of the healthy food being expensive, trust me, I know I do. Doing nutrition research around food security. I've written papers and things like that about it through my degree, and that's definitely an issue. I think it's it's a huge issue in terms of people living in poverty usually tend to have poorer diets than those not. So I think that's sort of something to be touched on and something to be considered, because diabetes is an expensive disease as it is, and trying to afford healthy food while also being able to afford things like insulin and pump supplies it's crazy that we're expected to do that, I think.
So another comment or suggestion that just came in, and it came in from my son, who has been doing keto, and it was a good reminder. He said, if you're going to do keto, you definitely need a scale because you're going to want to weigh your food. And then that leads me to remember that my son does a lot of these protein shakes and things too on the keto. What do you think about those and all of those types of products that you can buy out there that people can use? Do you have an opinion on that?
Yeah, so to kind of address a few of those things, the people who are finding a lot better blood sugar control when they're eating low carb, one thing that could influence that is the fact that you are measuring all your food and you're really thinking hard about what you're eating. So I know myself, having diabetes for almost 14 years, you definitely get complacent. And, rather than when you're about to eat a slice of toast, rather than looking at the label on the bread, you might just say, oh, I'm just going to take 1 unit for that, or I'm just going to take 2 units for that. Or you look at your plate right before you're about to eat and go, 30, right? So when you're doing a low carb diet, you're really thinking really hard about what you're putting into your body and, making sure you're staying under that threshold. So the carbs you do eat, you're probably dosing your insulin a lot more accurately for that. So it makes me kind of wonder and speculate if that may be part of the reason why people are finding a lot better blood sugars, is because there is a lot more accurate insulin dosing, and there's not that big margin of error by looking at a stack of pancakes and going 100 carbs, and or I'll take 5 units for that, or whatever that may be. I think all of us get complacent, and understandably. I mean, it's a relentless disease that you never get a break from. So I think that's understandable. But I think, before we resort to trying to cut out carbs and doing these very restrictive diets, think about doing a refresher on carb counting, or, looking at your ratios, or reviewing with your diabetes team, what can I do to fix my blood sugars after lunch or in the morning, or do I need an adjustment in my basal? So it is a little bit more work than just saying, I'm just going to cut out an entire food group. But it may be not as restrictive of a diet.
Is it fair to say that it would be easier for someone to do who's using an insulin pump as opposed to injections, as opposed to somebody who doesn't have diabetes? Because I know we do have viewers who don't have diabetes.
I think there's definitely a lot less to think about if you don't have diabetes in any aspect of your life. So yeah, I do, but some of the risks are still there. So the risk for electrolyte imbalances, or having the keto flu, or developing an unhealthy relationship with food, or kind of the social risk, which is something that we don't really talk about. We talk a lot about kind of the medical risk, but we don't talk about things like the social aspect of food, and feeling isolated when you can't go out to a restaurant with friends because you're worried that they may not have the low carb options, or whatever that may be. So I think in our society, where diet culture is sort of shoved down our throats so much, we need to be really mindful of making sure that we're maintaining that positive relationship with food. And that's something these diets make me worry about a lot.
Are there one of the comments coming out, are there any groups or online communities that you can either let us know about now, or later we can post something up that might be a good resource for people? I know when I started to get interested in keto, because Mackenzie was using it, I ended up going to Reddit, and there's a big, I don't even know if they call it a group, I guess, if you will. And there's a lot of information on there, a lot of recipes and experiences from people, but not necessarily type 1. And I actually don't even think I've come across that many. But are there any other resources that you would suggest if people want to look at, and maybe we can post them afterwards. But I just wondered what you thought about that.
For sure. I will caution everyone about taking health and medical and nutrition advice from strangers on the internet.
Yeah, fair enough.
If you do, if you have questions, I encourage you to see a registered dietitian. We are the most qualified to give nutrition advice. In order to become a registered dietitian, you have to have a 4-year degree from an accredited university. You have to do almost a year-long internship and work experience. You need to prove you're competent through a registration exam. So yeah, I will always caution against taking advice from people on the internet. Support groups, I think, are very, very important. And it's awesome to be able to have an online community that you can kind of vent to and get advice from. But I always caution against, consulting Dr. Google or Dr. WebMD or, someone on an online forum.
Well, that goes without saying for sure, is always to get that professional advice. But the reality is many people within the diabetes community self-reference with other people who have their same issues and experiences. So just wondering if there was a group like that, that acts as kind of moral support in addition to the clinical support that you would get. And if somebody doesn't go to a diabetes education center, what's the best way for them to go and see a dietitian? Is that something that they can just look up in their community and then go and book an appointment? And generally, what are those costs? Is that something that people can do as well, or can they be referred by a physician? Do you know anything about that?
So it's different in every province, and I think in each community it's different, and that's sort of an issue that we as dietitians are sort of working on advocating for. I know Ontario and Newfoundland both have a Dial a Dietitian program where you can call a number and get advice from a registered dietitian. I know there's a lot of dietitians in private practice that would be covered by insurance. So it really depends on kind of where you are. But anyone with diabetes should be regularly going to a diabetes education center. I know that's not always possible for a variety of different reasons. But I think the best way to go about that would be to get a referral from your family physician, because that, like, going to the diabetes clinic has honestly been, one of the biggest sources of support for me. There's a few different groups on Facebook, kind of, places to vent and things like that. But yeah, I will always caution against taking advice from those places, especially medical advice. But again, like, I'm a very big supporter of finding out what works for you and what works for your body. Everyone is so different, and it is very hard, as healthcare professionals, to come up with guidelines and be able to give advice that is applicable to everyone. So at the end of the day, it is your body, and you're the expert in your own body and what kind of works best for you.
Yeah. Well, it's good to have a buddy when you're going through certain parts of your life in whatever aspect. But we are familiar with some of those toll-free lines, and afterwards we'll put a posting up of some resources that people can access that way. So in order to actually, I've got a dog here scratching at me. He wants carbohydrates. But we can post those up for you. I'm just looking here to see what other.
And just to go back, the comment about kind of the supplements and things like that.
Oh yeah.
And kind of the protein shakes. I don't think I dove into that too much. We always recommend sort of the food first approach. So getting your nutrients from food, those are the ones that tend to be the most bioavailable, so the ones that are absorbed easiest by the body. And having a protein shake that may be packed with protein, but it's kind of about looking at what else is in there. So is that something that's also has a lot of sugar or a lot of artificial flavoring or whatever that may be? Taking supplements is again something that should be discussed with a dietitian. So if you are like on a certain diet, like someone with celiac disease, for example, may need to take an iron supplement or whatever that may be. So, but generally, if you're eating, a healthy diet, we recommend food first, and you probably don't need supplements unless that's been identified either in your blood work or through the type of diet that you may be on because of certain conditions.
Those are really good points, Jane. Thank you for that. One of the questions coming out is if you decide to go and book an appointment with a dietitian, how do you, and you're looking to explore a low carb or a keto diet, how do you know, or how should you ask ahead of time whether that dietitian is open to that or has experience with that, so that there isn't any, disappointment in booking the appointment?
So again, it depends on where you are and like whether the dietitian is on their own. So if it's someone in private practice who does their own booking, you may be able to talk to them beforehand and say, hey, look, I'm looking into this. Because each dietitian has their own specific professional scope.
Right.
So we kind of learn a surface knowledge of everything coming out of university, and then you sort of decide what you want to specialize in. So having a chat with your dietitian beforehand would be ideal. To kind of say, okay, are you open to this? Is this something that I'm looking at trying? And if it's someone who books through a receptionist, maybe ask them if they can kind of forward the answer on to you, and things like that. But yeah, definitely it depends on who you're booking with, and it depends on province and community and clinic. So I don't really have a solid answer for that, because I think it depends a lot on kind of where you're going and where you're looking.
Okay, well, our hour is coming to a close, and that was a lot of information, and I learned a lot myself, and I'm very thankful for that. I'm just going to scan here to see if we have any additional questions coming through. We are going to post after this Facebook Live just some resources for people to access. And if people have any questions afterwards, they can certainly submit them, and we'll pass them on to Jane and get answers for you. So I'm just going to ask if anybody else has a question out there. We have some viewers telling us that they learned a lot and to thank you. And we certainly thank you for taking the time. And, it's important to talk to people who, have diabetes too, because they get it. There's a lot of things that you don't have to say. And we appreciate your insight and all of your suggestions on that. So thank you very much for your time. And I don't see any other questions that are coming through. So look at that, right bang at 8 o'clock. So good night, everybody. And thanks for joining us. And take care. Have a good night. Bye-bye now.
Bye, everyone.